My parents said Grandpa left nothing behind, they forgot about one safe. I found out my grandfather was gone from a text message. Not a phone call. Not my mother's voice cracking on the other end of the line. A text message sent at 6:47 in the morning that read, "Dad passed last night. Funeral Saturday. Don't wear anything flashy." That was it. 11 words about the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who sat with me every Sunday of my childhood shelling pecans on his porch, who used to tell me that I was the only one in the family who ever really listened to him. 11 words and a warning about my wardrobe. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after reading that message. My husband, Daniel, was still asleep beside me, and I remember staring at the ceiling fan going in slow circles, feeling like the room had tilted just slightly to one side. Grandpa Elias was 83. He'd been sick for a while, we all knew that, but knowing something is coming and having it actually arrive are two very different kinds of pain. I felt the grief first, sharp and immediate, the kind that sits right behind your sternum. And underneath that, quieter, I felt something else. A kind of dread. Because I knew, even in that first raw moment, that whatever happened next with my family was not going to be simple. My name is Claire. I'm 34 years old, I have a 9-year-old daughter named Josie, and I am, according to my mother, the disappointing one. Not because I did anything wrong. I never got into trouble, never dropped out of anything, never embarrassed anyone at a dinner party. My sin, if you can call it that, was leaving. I moved 4 hours away for a job when I was 26, married a man my parents thought was fine, I suppose, and stopped showing up for every single family function like it was my job to perform loyalty. My younger brother, Preston, stayed. He lived 20 minutes from our parents, dropped by on Sundays, called our mother every other day. Preston was the good one. Preston was the one who got the extra key to the house, the one whose name was always mentioned first, the one who got asked for his opinion at holidays while mine hung in the air like something nobody wanted to touch. But Grandpa Elias was different. Grandpa Elias was my mother's father, not my father's, which already made him a strange outlier in that house. A man who'd married in from a family my mother considered beneath her own, according to things I'd overheard as a child. He lived alone in a small brick house 2 streets over from my parents for as long as I could remember, ever since my grandmother died when I was 6. And every single Sunday without fail, while my parents were busy performing their version of family life with Preston at the center of it, I would walk to Grandpa's house and we would shell pecans on his porch and he would tell me stories about the war, about the factory he worked at for 40 years, about my grandmother and how she used to burn toast on purpose because she liked the smell. He used to say things to me. Small things at the time. Things I didn't think much of as a kid. "You're the one who listens, Claire Bear. Preston hears things. You listen." Or, "When I'm gone, you make sure they don't paint me into something I wasn't." I used to think that was just an old man being sentimental. I didn't understand, not really until much later, that he was trying to tell me something important, and that I was the only one paying close enough attention to eventually understand it. The funeral was on a Saturday in late October, cold enough that everyone's breath showed in the air by the graveside. I wore a gray dress, nothing flashy, exactly as instructed. My mother, Deborah, stood at the front in black, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue she never actually used, greeting the guests like she was hosting rather than grieving. My father, Richard, stood beside her with his hands folded, saying almost nothing, which was his default setting for every emotional event in our family history. Preston stood on my mother's other side, and I noticed, even through my own grief, the way people kept touching his shoulder, kept telling him how strong he was being, how much he'd done for Grandpa these last few years. I stood a little apart, holding Daniel's hand, holding Josie's hand, feeling like a guest at my own grandfather's funeral. After the burial, we all went back to my parents' house, the way families do, everyone bringing casseroles nobody would eat and standing around in living rooms speaking in hushed, careful voices. It was there, 3 days after the funeral, not even a week, that my mother gathered the family in the living room and made an announcement that would end up changing everything. "We've been through Dad's papers," she said, standing by the fireplace with a manila folder in her hands, the way a teacher stands in front of a classroom. "And I want to be honest with everyone, because there's no use pretending otherwise. There isn't much. The house was in worse shape than we thought, there were medical bills we didn't know about, and honestly, kids, there just isn't an estate to speak of. Dad left nothing behind." I remember the specific silence that followed that sentence. Not sad silence. Something more like relief, like the air in the room had been holding its breath and could finally let go. My father nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd expected. Preston looked down at his hands. Nobody asked a single follow-up question. Nobody asked to see the papers. Nobody asked what nothing actually meant in dollar terms, or what happened to the house, or the truck Grandpa kept in that immaculate garage, or the savings account he used to mention offhand every now and then. My family accepted nothing the way you accept weather. As a fact of nature, not something to be investigated. But something in me went very still and very quiet, because I remembered something Grandpa had told me, maybe 8 months before he died, sitting on that porch with a bowl of pecans between us. He'd looked at me with those pale blue eyes of his, cloudier than they used to be, and said, "Claire Bear, whatever happens, whatever they tell you happens, you go looking for the safe. You understand me? The safe." At the time I'd laughed it off gently, the way you do with an old man who sometimes repeated himself, who sometimes drifted into stories that didn't quite connect. I said, "What safe, Grandpa?" And he just smiled, that small closed-mouth smile he had, and said, "You'll know when you need to know." I hadn't thought about that conversation in months. Standing in my mother's living room, hearing the word nothing hang in the air like a verdict nobody wanted to appeal, that memory came rushing back so vividly I could almost smell the pecan shells again. I didn't say anything that day. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story where I marched in and demanded answers on the spot. I was raised in a house where questioning my mother's version of events was treated as a character flaw, and old habits like that don't just disappear because you're 34 and married with a kid of your own. I nodded along with everyone else. I ate a slice of the pound cake somebody's aunt had brought. I hugged my mother goodbye and told her I loved her, which was true, even if loving her had never been simple. But in the car on the way home, with Josie asleep in the back seat and Daniel driving through the dark, I told him what Grandpa had said about the safe. Daniel is a quiet, steady kind of man, not prone to conspiracy theories or dramatics, and I remember him going quiet for a long moment before he said, "Claire, I think you need to go back to that house." It took me almost 2 weeks to work up the nerve. Grief does strange things to your sense of time. Some days felt like they lasted a month, others blurred together into nothing. But finally, on a Tuesday when I knew my mother would be at her book club and my father would be at his usual Tuesday golf outing, I drove the 4 hours back to my hometown and let myself into Grandpa's house with the spare key he'd given me years ago, the one I don't think anyone else in the family knew I still had. The house smelled like him still, like pipe tobacco he hadn't smoked in years and old paper, and the particular mustiness of a house that had been lived in by one careful, quiet man for a very long time. Nobody had touched much of it yet. My mother had said something about hiring an estate company to handle the clearing out, once probate was settled, whatever that meant to her, and so the room still looked frozen in the moment he'd left them. His reading glasses were still on the side table. There was a coffee mug in the sink that nobody had washed. I started in the obvious places the way you do, feeling a little foolish like a child playing detective. I checked his bedroom closet. I checked under the bed. I checked the filing cabinet in the small room he used as an office, which held mostly old tax documents and warranty papers for appliances he'd probably replaced twice since buying them. Nothing that looked like a safe, nothing that looked hidden. I was starting to wonder if the whole thing had just been an old man's confusion, some fragment of a memory or a dream he'd mistaken for reality, when I remembered something else he used to say, something that had always struck me as odd but that I'd never examined closely. He used to say every single time I left his house after our Sunday visits, "Mind the third step, Claire Bear, it's got a mind of its own." And it was true, the third step down into his basement had always creaked and wobbled slightly under your foot, more than any of the others, and I'd simply assumed my whole life that it was just old wood settling the way old wood does. I went down into the basement. It was cold and smelled like concrete, and the particular chemical smell of the old furnace that hadn't run in a while. I knelt down at the third step, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit, and I pressed my palm against the wood. It gave slightly more than a step should, and when I looked closer I could see that the front edge of the step wasn't flush the way the others were. There was the faintest seam, the kind you'd never notice unless you were looking for it, unless someone had specifically told you where to look. It took me almost 20 minutes to figure out how it opened, my fingers cold and clumsy, before I found the small recessed latch tucked up under the lip of the step above it. When I finally released it, the front panel of the step swung outward like a tiny door, and behind it, in a shallow compartment lined with what looked like an old towel, sat a small gray fireproof safe, not much bigger than a shoebox, with a combination dial on the front. I sat on that basement floor for a long time just looking at it, my hands trembling slightly, feeling like I'd stepped into some version of my life I hadn't known existed. I didn't have the combination. Of course I didn't. Grandpa hadn't given me a number, only a location, and I remember feeling a wave of frustration so sharp it almost brought me to tears. Right there in that cold basement, holding a locked box that might contain nothing at all, or might contain everything. I tried the obvious combinations first. His birthday. My grandmother's birthday, Eleanor, the woman he'd loved for 51 years. My mother's birthday, though something in me resisted trying that one, some instinct that told me this safe had nothing to do with her. None of them worked. I sat there running through memories of him, searching for some number, some date, that would have mattered enough to him to lock away his secrets behind it. And then I thought of the pecans. Every single Sunday of my childhood we shelled pecans together on that porch, and every single time without fail, he would tell me the same small ritual fact, like a joke he never got tired of telling. He'd say, "You know, Claire Bear, I proposed to your grandmother on the 9th of April, but she made me wait until the 14th of June to actually get an answer. Longest 2 months of my life. 9th of April. 14th of June." I tried it as a combination 0-9-0-4, then adjusted, tried 04090614, different combinations of those numbers until finally, on maybe the 6th attempt, with fingers so cold they'd gone half numb, the dial clicked and the small door of the safe swung open. Inside, wrapped carefully in a plastic sleeve to protect it from moisture, was a stack of papers, and on top of that stack, a smaller sealed envelope with my name written on it in his handwriting. Just Claire in that shaky, careful cursive he'd developed in his last few years, when his hands had started to tremble. I didn't open the envelope right away. I want to be honest about that too because I think it matters. I sat on that basement floor and I cried hard, the kind of crying that comes up from somewhere you didn't know you were storing it, because holding that envelope with my name on it felt like he was still there, still choosing me, still trusting me with something even after he was gone. When I finally composed myself enough to open it, the letter inside was short, but every word in it rearranged something in my chest. He wrote that he knew what my parents would say when he died. He wrote that he'd watched for years the way my mother spoke about money, the way she'd started asking him pointed questions about his accounts once his health started declining, the way Preston had started coming around more often in his final 2 years, always kind, always helpful, but always somehow steering conversations toward paperwork, toward power of attorney, toward just making things easier down the road. He wrote that he loved his daughter, my mother, but that he wasn't blind, and that he'd watched her do to me, over decades, exactly what he suspected she intended to do to me one final time after his death, erase me from the story entirely. And then he wrote something that made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped the letter. He wrote that the house I'd grown up 2 streets away from wasn't going to my mother, and it wasn't going to Preston. He'd transferred it, quietly 18 months before he died, along with a modest but very real investment account he'd built slowly over 40 years of factory work and careful saving, into a trust. And I was the sole beneficiary. Underneath the letter, in the stack of papers, were the documents to prove it. A deed with a transfer date. Trust paperwork drawn up by a lawyer whose name I didn't recognize, someone clearly not the family lawyer my parents had always used, someone Grandpa had sought out on his own, quietly, deliberately, so that nobody in the family would know until it was already done. There were bank statements showing an account balance that made me sit back against the cold basement wall. An amount that was not enormous by the standards of the wealthy, but that was, to me, staggering, life-changing, more money than I'd ever imagined my grandfather had accumulated in his careful, unassuming way. And there was one more thing in that safe, something that turned my grief into something colder and sharper. A stack of printed emails between my mother and a lawyer, dated from the last year of Grandpa's life. I didn't understand at first why he would have these, how he could possibly have gotten copies of his own daughter's private correspondence, until I read further and understood. My mother had apparently, at some point during one of her visits to help manage his affairs, used his home computer to email a lawyer of her own, one specializing in elder estate matters, and Grandpa, sharper than any of them gave him credit for, had found the emails still open in the browser history and printed them before she thought to clear it. In them my mother asked, in language that made my stomach turn, About the process for challenging or amending a will if her father were to become less capable of managing his own decisions. She asked about timelines. She asked, chillingly, about what would happen to any prior arrangements he might have made without the family's knowledge, and whether those could be revisited if it turned out he wasn't of sound enough mind when he made them. I sat in that basement for what must have been an hour, reading and rereading those printed emails, feeling something in me go very cold and very still. My mother hadn't just been indifferent to what her father might have wanted. She had been actively strategizing in the last year of his life about how to override his wishes if they turned out to be inconvenient to her. And somewhere in the middle of that strategizing, apparently, she told the rest of the family that there was nothing to inherit at all, which now, sitting there with a trust document in my lap proving otherwise, read less like an accident of paperwork and more like the opening move of something. I didn't confront anyone that day. I gathered the documents carefully, placed the safe back into its hidden compartment beneath the third step exactly the way I'd found it, and drove home in a kind of numb, focused silence that worried Daniel the moment I walked through the door. I told him everything that night after Josie was asleep, sitting at our kitchen table with the copies I'd made spread out between us like evidence in a trial, because in some sense that's exactly what they were. "You need a lawyer," Daniel said, which was the obvious, practical thing to say, and I knew he was right. But underneath the practical part of me, there was something else stirring. Something I hadn't expected to feel. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter. A kind of clarity. My whole life I had been the afterthought in that family, the one who moved away, the one who wasn't quite enough, the one whose feelings were treated as less urgent than everyone else's comfort. And here finally was proof, undeniable and documented, that at least one person in that family had seen me clearly the entire time, had trusted me, had chosen me deliberately on purpose because he knew exactly what kind of woman I was, and exactly what kind of woman my mother had become. I found a lawyer 2 weeks later, a careful, unhurried woman named Marisol Vance who specialized in trust and estate disputes, recommended by a friend of Daniel's from work. I brought her the documents, the letter, the emails, everything, and I watched her expression shift as she read through them, from professional neutrality into something closer to quiet outrage on my behalf. "This trust is airtight," she told me, tapping the document with one finger. "Properly witnessed, properly notarized, executed while your grandfather was, by every available record, of completely sound mind. Your mother could try to challenge it, but given what's in these emails, she'd be handing a judge a motive on a silver platter. I'd honestly be surprised if she tries." "What about the safe?" I asked. "Does it matter that I found it? That I took the documents without telling anyone?" Marisol shook her head. "You're the named beneficiary of a validly executed trust. You didn't take anything that wasn't already legally yours. If anything, Claire, the concerning question here isn't what you did. It's what your mother told the rest of the family and why." That question sat with me for weeks. I kept thinking about my father's face, nodding along when my mother announced there was nothing. I kept thinking about Preston, looking down at his hands, accepting that word without a single follow-up question, the way you accept something you've already been told to expect. Had they known? Had my mother told them the truth privately and simply decided, together, to keep it from me specifically? Or had she lied to everyone equally, protecting some plan only she fully understood? I didn't know yet. But I intended to find out, and I intended to do it in a way that Grandpa, I think, would have appreciated. Quietly. Carefully. Without shouting. The legal process of formally claiming the trust took almost 3 months, moving at the particular glacial pace that legal things do, full of notarized copies and filing deadlines and phone calls with Marisol's paralegal about documents I needed to sign. During those 3 months, I said nothing to my family. I went to Thanksgiving at my parents' house and sat at the same table as my mother, passing the mashed potatoes, listening to Preston talk about his new promotion, feeling like I was made of glass, like the truth I was carrying might shatter something the moment it caught the light. My mother, at one point during that dinner, mentioned offhandedly that she and my father were thinking of finally selling Grandpa's old house, now that probate on his other affairs was basically settled, and using the proceeds to help Preston with a down payment on a bigger place for his growing family. I remember setting my fork down very carefully, and saying nothing, and feeling Daniel's hand find mine under the table. That was the moment, I think, when whatever quiet forgiveness I'd still been holding on to finally hardened into something else. Because Grandpa's house wasn't hers to sell. It hadn't been hers for over a year and a half. And she was standing in her own dining room, over the very meal meant to celebrate gratitude, casually planning to give away something that legally belonged to me, without the faintest idea that I already knew. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't loud. I want to be clear about that because I know these stories are often expected to end in shouting, in dramatic scenes where someone throws a glass of wine or storms out into the rain. That's not what happened, and honestly I don't think Grandpa would have wanted that from me anyway. What happened was quieter, and in some ways I think it landed harder because of it. I called a family meeting myself for the first time in my life at my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon in late January, 3 months after Grandpa's death. Once every piece of paperwork with Marisol's office was finalized and the trust was fully, legally, undeniably mine. I told my mother I had something important to discuss regarding Grandpa's estate, and I watched something flicker behind her eyes when I said it, something that told me, even before I said another word, that some part of her had been waiting for this moment, dreading it for months. We sat in the same living room where she'd made her announcement about nothing. My father sat beside her. Preston sat across from me on the love seat, his wife beside him. I brought a folder of my own this time, a manila folder just like my mother's had been, and I set it on the coffee table between us without opening it right away. I want to start, I said, and I remember my voice was steady, calmer than I expected it to be, by saying that I loved Grandpa very much, and I think all of us in this room did too in our own ways. I'm not here to punish anyone or to make this ugly. But I found something after the funeral that I think you all deserve to know about, and that I have a legal obligation to inform you about now that the process is complete. I opened the folder. I laid out the deed, the trust documents, the bank statements, the letter he'd written me, everything except the printed emails, which I chose deliberately to hold back for the moment, because I wasn't there to humiliate my mother in front of Preston and his wife. I was there to tell the truth. I watched my mother's face as she read the documents, watched the color drain slowly out of it, watched her hands, usually so composed, begin to tremble slightly at the edges of the papers. My father read over her shoulder and said nothing, his jaw tightening in the way it always did when he was choosing silence over confrontation. Preston looked up at me, genuinely stunned, and said, "Wait, he left you the house? And the account? All of it?" "He left it to me 18 months before he died," I said. "In a properly executed trust. I found the paperwork in a safe he told me about before he passed, hidden in the basement. I've had it verified by a lawyer. It's legally mine." The silence that followed was different from the silence 3 months earlier. That first silence had been relief. This one was something closer to a held breath before an explosion that never quite came, because my mother, to her credit or perhaps to her calculation, chose not to explode. She set the papers down very carefully and said, in a voice I almost didn't recognize, thin and controlled, "I told everyone there was nothing because that's what I believed, Claire. I didn't know about any of this." And this was the moment I had been quietly dreading and quietly preparing for in equal measure, because I knew the second she said it, that I had a choice to make. I could let that lie stand, could accept her version and let this end here, painful but survivable, family intact in whatever fragile shape it had always existed in. Or I could tell the truth, the whole truth, the way Grandpa had wanted someone to, eventually, when it mattered. I reached back into my bag and pulled out the second folder, the one with the printed emails, and I set it on the table beside the first one, unopened, my hand resting on top of it. "Mom," I said, and I kept my voice as gentle as I could manage, because some part of me even then still wanted to protect her from herself. "There's something else in that safe. Emails printed out between you and an estate lawyer from about a year before Grandpa died. Do you want me to open this folder in front of everyone? Or do you want to tell Preston and Dad yourself what's in it?" I have never, in 34 years, seen my mother's face do what it did in that moment. Something collapsed behind her eyes, some careful architecture she'd been maintaining for months, maybe years, finally giving way. She looked at the folder, then at me, then at Preston, who was watching her now with a confused, wary expression that told me he genuinely hadn't known anything, that whatever role he'd played in our family's imbalance over the years, he hadn't been part of this particular plan. "I was trying to protect the family," she said finally, quietly, And I could hear in her voice that she believed that, at least partially, even as she said it. Dad was getting older. His judgment wasn't always what it used to be. I was worried he'd make decisions that weren't fair, that weren't thought through, and I wanted to understand our options if that happened. He signed that trust 18 months before he died, I said. Marisol had his doctor's records reviewed as part of the process. He was of completely sound mind. You weren't protecting him from bad judgment, Mom. You were trying to figure out how to undo a decision you didn't like, made by a man who was still perfectly capable of making it. And when it turned out you couldn't undo it, you told everyone there was nothing at all, rather than admit he'd chosen to leave something specifically to me. I didn't open the folder of emails in front of everyone. I want to be honest about that because it would have been easy in that moment to go for the full devastating reveal, to read those chilling lines out loud in front of Preston and my father and let the humiliation land as hard as it possibly could. Part of me wanted to. But I thought about Grandpa, about the kind of man he was, quiet and careful and never once cruel even when he had every right to be, and I decided that wasn't the ending I wanted either. I left the folder closed on the table and said, I'm not here to destroy anything. I'm here because I'm done being the person in this family who gets talked about instead of talked to. You can read what's in there on your own time. I think you already know what it says. Nobody said much after that. My father, finally breaking his silence, said quietly, Deborah, is this true? And my mother didn't answer him, which was, in its own way, an answer. Preston sat very still for a long moment, and then he did something I didn't expect. He got up, walked around the coffee table and hugged me tightly, the way he hadn't since we were children, and said, I'm sorry, Claire. I didn't know. I should have asked more questions over the years. About a lot of things. I left that house that afternoon lighter than I had felt in years, not because the conversation had gone perfectly, not because my mother apologized the way I might have wanted her to in some fantasy version of events, but because for the first time in my adult life, the truth was sitting out in the open where everyone could see it, instead of curled up quietly inside me where it had always lived before. In the months that followed, things didn't magically repair themselves, and I think that's important to say honestly, because real families don't heal in a single afternoon. My relationship with my mother became something distant and careful, polite at holidays, a few phone calls a year. None of the warmth we'd never really had to begin with, but at least none of the pretending either. My relationship with Preston, strangely, grew stronger. He started calling me more, asking about Josie, apologizing in small ways over time for years of silent complicity. He was only now starting to understand. My father never said much about any of it, but he started sending me occasional texts, small unremarkable things, a photo of a bird at his feeder, a joke he'd read somewhere, gestures that felt, for a man like him, like a kind of quiet apology of their own. I kept Grandpa's house. I didn't sell it, not right away, even though the practical part of me knew I probably should. I spent a weekend that spring cleaning it out slowly, carefully, keeping the things that mattered, his reading glasses, an old photo of him and my grandmother on their wedding day, the mug from the sink that I finally washed and packed away. I found myself more than once sitting on that porch where we used to shell pecans, feeling him there in a way I couldn't quite explain, feeling like he was watching, satisfied, from somewhere just out of view. Eventually, Daniel and I decided to use part of what Grandpa left us to help move closer to my hometown, close enough that Josie could grow up the way I had, with a grandfather figure nearby. Except this time it would be different, because I intended to make sure Josie always knew exactly where she stood in this family, with no ambiguity, no waiting for a hidden safe to tell her the truth about how much she mattered. I think about that safe often, tucked beneath that creaky third step, waiting patiently for over a year for someone to come looking. I think about how easily I could have laughed off his warning as an old man's confusion, how close I came to never checking at all. And I think about what he wrote in that letter, the line I've returned to more than any other in the months since. He wrote, I know they'll try to make you small, Claire Bear, because that's what they've always done. But I saw you. I saw you the whole time. And I wanted you to know it even after I was gone. My mother eventually did tell me months later, in one of our brief, careful phone calls, that she'd read the emails in that folder alone in her car in the driveway, before she could bring herself to go inside her own house. She didn't apologize exactly, not in the way I might have wanted as a child still living somewhere inside me. But she said something that stuck with me. She said, I don't think I ever understood what he saw in you that he didn't see in the rest of us. I think honestly I was jealous of it even as a grown woman, which sounds ridiculous to say out loud. I didn't know what to do with that admission at the time, and I'm still not entirely sure I do now. But I've come to believe that it was, in its own small imperfect way, the truest thing my mother ever said to me. I don't tell this story because I want anyone listening to hate my mother, or to think of this as some triumphant, vengeful ending where the villain gets destroyed and the hero rides off into the sunset. Families are messier than that, and grief is messier than that, and even now, more than a year later, there are days I miss the family I wished I'd had more than I'm grateful for the family I actually got. But I do think about that porch and those pecans, and an old man who noticed the quiet daughter nobody else was paying attention to, and who made sure in his own careful, deliberate way, that the truth would eventually find its way to daylight, even if he wasn't there to see it happen himself. Sometimes the people who love us most aren't the loudest ones in the room. Sometimes they're the ones sitting quietly on a porch, shelling pecans, watching, remembering, and waiting for exactly the right moment to make sure you finally get seen. There's a small postscript to all of this that I've thought about including or leaving out, and I've decided in the end to include it because I think it says something true about how these stories actually end in real life quietly without a bow tied neatly around them. About 8 months after that Sunday afternoon in my parents' living room, my mother asked if she could come visit Grandpa's house while I was still clearing it out. I almost said no. Some part of me wanted to protect that space, to keep it as something entirely mine, untouched by the woman who tried to erase my place in it. But I said yes because I think some part of me also wanted to understand her, or at least to give her the chance to understand herself. She walked through those rooms slowly, touching things the way you do in a place heavy with memory, and when we got to the kitchen, she stopped at the window over the sink and said without turning around, "He used to stand right here every morning with his coffee and watch the birds at that feeder. I used to think it was strange how much time he spent doing nothing. Just watching." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I think that's what he was doing with you too all those Sundays. Just watching. I never had the patience for it. I always needed things to be moving, to be accomplished. I think that's why he trusted you with this and not me. You knew how to sit still long enough to actually see him." I didn't say anything right away. I remember the particular quality of the silence in that kitchen. Sunlight coming in slanted through the window the way it always did in the late afternoon, dust moving slowly through the light. Finally I said, "You could have asked me about him more, you know. While he was alive. I would have told you things." "I know," she said. "I think I was afraid of what I'd hear. That he loved you more plainly than he ever loved me, and that I'd have to sit with that instead of just being angry about it after the fact." It wasn't an apology, not exactly. Not in the clean way I used to imagine apologies working when I was younger and thought forgiveness was a single conversation instead of a long, uneven road. But it was honest, and coming from my mother, honesty had always been harder to come by than almost anything else, so I let it be enough for that day. We didn't fix everything in that kitchen. I want to be clear about that because I think there's a temptation telling stories like this one, to wrap the ending up too neatly, to suggest that one moment of vulnerability erases years of being made to feel invisible in your own family. It doesn't work that way, not for me, and I suspect not for most people who've lived through something similar. But something did shift that afternoon, some small recalibration in how we stood in relation to each other, and in the years since that recalibration has held mostly. We are not close the way some mothers and daughters are close. But we are honest now in a way we never managed to be before, and some days sitting with Josie on my own porch these days shelling pecans the way Grandpa taught me, I think that honesty might be the closest thing to a happy ending this particular story was ever going to get. And I've come to believe that's not a small thing at all. I think in the end it might be the whole point.